Welcome everyone to the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. We have a special event for you today as we will be launching the new textbook, Animal Rights Law, written by our very own Raffael, Fasel and Butler, co-founders of the Cambridge Center for Animal Rights Law. So my name is Eva Bernard Kempers. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Animal and Law Chair of the University of Antwerp in Belgium. And since January this year, I'm also working at the Cambridge Center as a junior research associate. It is my pleasure to introduce and moderate the event for you today. So I'm sure that most of you will know Jean and Raffael, but for those who don't, Jean is a fellow of St. Edmund's College, Cambridge, and an affiliated lecturer at the Cambridge Law faculty. Raffael is a visiting fellow at the Shell Center for International Human Rights at Yale Law School, and he's also an affiliated lecturer at the Cambridge Law faculty. So the book launch today will have a slightly different structure than our usual talks. We are delighted to have two animal rights experts with us today, Joshua Jowett and Sabian Bliss, who will lead a conversation with the authors about their textbook. So Joshua Jowett is a lecturer in law at the University of Newcastle. His research focuses on questions of animal legal personhood and natural law, and he's teaching his own course in animal rights law. Sabian Bliss is a PhD candidate at the Radboud University Nijmegen in the Netherlands, and her research focuses on the conflict between protecting individual animals and protecting species. After the conversation, which will last about 50 minutes, there will be ample time for you to ask your questions to Jean and Raffael directly. Please note that we will record the conversation between Joshua, Sabian and the authors, but not the discussion with the audience. For those of you who have not ordered the book yet, you can do so through the link in the chats using the discount codes. My book just arrived today. So I will now give the floor to Sabian and Joshua to start the conversation.
Thank you very much, Eva.
Thanks, Eva.
I'd like to begin by saying my book arrived recently as well. So if you haven't ordered that, I can confirm it smells absolutely incredible. And the content's pretty good too. But before we start turning to that, I'm a big fan of a good origin story. So my first question to Raffael and Sean is, how did you arrive at animal law? I mean, I know that we're all interested, we've got skin in the game, but it's still a fairly niche subject in a lot of law schools. So I wonder if you'd mind by telling us to begin with how you became interested in this topic. Don't fight to answer that first.
I was going to say, why don't you start, Raffael? You've got a longer history of it than me.
Happy to start. I am personally from a family that had lots of companion animals. We were usually surrounded by companion animals, and I guess that gave me a sort of an initial sort of sense of awareness of, you know, the individualities and the personalities that these animals have, similar ways to we humans have them. I then went into law and was struck by how the law, for the most part, still treats animals, what their status is as property, and sort of accordingly what that allows humans to do with animals. And I was also struck by just the absence of theoretical reflection on that status and, you know, whether it should change, what it would entail. There was, of course, already a lot of ethical literature on the subject, you know, your Peter Singer, Tom Regan, what have you, and many other great scholars. But I found that there was relatively little done in the law by legal scholars, you know, reflecting on those questions and trying to see where they can lead us. So that's sort of my background, how I became interested in the question.
So I was an unrepentant carnivore until about 7 years ago. And Raffael, when he was a PhD student at Cambridge, ran a series of workshops, seminars, of which this is a continuing one. And I went to one of them, and I think it was maybe Don Broom. It was on welfare and potential for rights, and was fascinated and intrigued and appalled and all those things. I'd read, Peter Singer's stuff 10 years earlier and found it really hard. And so I, obviously didn't follow up any of that. And then, as I say, got interested in what Raffael was doing and the things that his guests and he was talking about, and felt that it was just a big thing. It was just a huge idea that I never thought about. I contacted Raffael and said, why don't we put on an animal rights law course? And he agreed. And we did. We spent, or at least I spent, quite a long time reading up and so on. And we put together a lecture series over the sort of spring and summer. And about 6 years ago, started our own lecture course. The law faculty at Cambridge was very helpful. They gave us a lecture room and put us on the timetable and allowed us to advertise. So I think at 5 o'clock or something, in a sort of wintry Cambridge afternoon, which if you haven't been there, is, needs to be enjoyed, to be believed. Sort of dark, cold, damp Cambridge 5 o'clock. 20, 25 people would come along and listen to an hour-long lecture every week for 2 terms, and it went from there.
I mean, 25 is a big number for what's in a sense a voluntary course, isn't it? Were you surprised by the interest that was out there, or was that something that you secretly expected, given what we all know is a fascinating area of law?
I don't know. I think, it's hard to sort of envisage these things. I suppose I didn't see it as a difficult number, because we were trawling through the whole of the university, and so that was bringing in all sorts of people, environmental, from the vet school, as well as from law. We were pleased with the number. I mean, they were super. They were super times, and that sort of motivated us to press on.
Did that spur your sort of motivation for producing the book? You had, students from different faculties. And in terms of how you've structured the book, I mean, you've got various practical exercises, which I've been trying to do myself, some thought exercises and experiments. So who did you have in mind when you were designing these? Is it purely law students, or do you think it's applicable to a wider variety of people?
It certainly did, Sebi, and maybe just to take a step back there, the reason why we wrote this textbook was, when we started offering that course that Sean mentioned, first on a sort of optional basis, and then it became an official part of the Cambridge Law degree. We looked for potential books that we could use and assign to our students, and we realized that while there's many great books focused on specific jurisdictions, and then usually with a sort of focus on, welfare laws, there is really no book focusing specifically on animal rights law. And, we took that as a challenge, and we thought, why don't we write the book? Sort of, first we offer the course, then we get a sense of, what works for the students, what topics we need to cover. And then with that sort of information, with that data, we started developing the book. And then that in turn helped us, rethink our course. So actually we should maybe change this and change that. And more specific to your question about, whom the book is addressing, our book has, I guess, a couple of features that I hope makes it sort of a useful book. First, it is supposed to be accessible, right? So you mentioned, students, which students? If you have a law background, that can help you read the book, but the book wasn't written in such a way that you require a legal background, right? So, if you're a first-year law student, or, a PhD student in law, or you're maybe doing veterinary, sciences, or you're a philosopher or an economist, or whatever the case may be, we hope that the book is written in such a way that you will be able to understand it. In fact, it's got a useful glossary at the end of the book, which we've written specifically with a view to explaining sort of key terms. You'll find it at the end of the book if that's of interest. So it has that element of the access of being accessible, we hope. Another element that sort of characterizes it and why we wanted to write this particular book was we wanted it to be global. So I mentioned that there's quite a few books out there that are focused, say, on just Australia, or just Germany, or whatever jurisdiction you might be interested in. but there was no book looking at animal rights law from that global perspective, not international, although we talk about international law, but global in a sense of all different jurisdictions that are out there. So that's another sort of feature that I think sort of characterizes the book, makes it a useful one. And then perhaps sort of lastly, what we try to do, and that goes also to your point about, students, we want this to be a balanced book in the sense that this isn't, a manifesto for animal rights law, as helpful as it may be for those who want to use it, to argue for animal rights on the ground. So activists may find it very useful, but we sort of try to really present the debates from different points of views. There's different perspectives. Here is what some people argue. This is what some people object to. And, sort of here's how the debate has been going. We don't want to impose our own views on people. They should make up their own minds. And the exercises that you mentioned, serve the purpose of allowing students and others interested in making up their own views about the topic.
And I know I personally, as I said this to you in the past, Raffael, I really like those practical exercises, the way they're integrated in the book. I think they do a great job at doing what they do. But before we dive headfirst into that substance and the actual content, I've got a related question, I suppose, about the use of the book and where we see this is situated in the field. For context, and I owe a great debt of gratitude to you both here, the course we run in Newcastle on animal rights law was greatly influenced by the course you offer at Cambridge and the teachers' workshop that you very kindly and very generously put on for us. And the reading list that I use is very heavily influenced by the one you kindly shared. And for people in the room who haven't seen this reading list, it was a very, very old school reading list. There's a lot of case law, there's a lot of journal articles, the kind of stuff that I remember from my days as an undergraduate, precisely because there was no textbook available when that reading list was written up. So that background context out of the side, my question, I suppose, is how do you see the textbook as fitting into your own reading list now that you're teaching this course and this is available? Do you see this as kind of replacing that broad church approach or supplementing it? Or how do you see this being used in that educational context?
I think, it's an interesting question, as you're right. When we sort of started, we were pulling together a lot of really interesting stuff, but very diverse. I think certainly one objective of the course, of the book, and so on, has been that we wanted to normalize animal rights law. We wanted to make it normal. We want to make it a normal subject that in particular law, because that's what we know about, in what law students study. We want law students to go, oh yeah, I'm doing land law, I'm doing criminal law, I'm doing, whatever EU, and I'm doing animal rights law. And we wanted students to think about it and study it as a normal subject. And that, of course, means students without any antecedent interest in animal welfare, without any, particular carnivore, omnivore preferences, none of that, just as a normal course. So in many ways, we designed it, particularly when we were writing the course for the university. We designed it to fit with normal expectations of a law course. But I'd say more broadly, we wanted it to be for people to think of it as a normal subject that can be approached in a traditional way. And I think, as Raffael said, of course, it's going to be hopefully of interest, certainly hopefully usable by people with objectives and political objectives and so on. And that's fine. I think specifically to answer your question, I think it's going to be like any textbook, and it depends on the course and the amount of time students have to do the reading. If your students have only got a few hours, then hopefully the textbook will appear on the must-do reading, and you'll drop a few of your own favorite articles in there on top. But we're rather hoping, expecting, assuming that people will just use it as a stepping off point, and how much lecturers add to it will be largely a function of the amount of reading they expect their students to do.
Perhaps just to make a bit more publicity here, the textbook comes with a companion website, just to go to your point, Josh. So if people are interested in, say, exploring, any scholarship that may exist on their own legal system, the companion website most likely will include, some references on your jurisdiction. We really try to be as sort of inclusive as we can. It's also got some other, it's just literature suggestions if you're interested in a particular topic that a chapter of the book covers. So very much, yes, as Sean was saying, the idea of a springboard that people can use to then, dive deeper or go wider, explore other questions.
It certainly would have helped me at the beginning of my PhD, saved me a lot of legwork if I'd had this, rather than doing all my own reading of, all these different things. And in terms of the sort of the topics that you cover, obviously you cover all the traditional ones. Are there any emerging topics which you didn't have the scope to raise in this book, but you think are really important in the context of animal rights law?
Quite a few, actually, and it's something that we had to sort of concede in the introduction of the book. Look, this is just an introductory text, so we had to ignore many topics that we personally think could be really interesting, but that, wouldn't have fit into the 200 pages or so that we could have. So among the topics, I think that would be really interesting and that are relevant for animal rights are, the rights of nature debates, the connection between animal rights and rights of nature. We hint at it here and there, but we didn't really have the space to explore it in depth. Perhaps something for a second edition if we sell enough copies. So that's definitely something that we could have addressed. There's a sort of an emerging discussion on, artificial intelligences, robots, non-animal entities, to what extent they may deserve some similar protections to animals or humans, for that matter. It's also something we couldn't explore in the book.
I mean, you've kind of thrown me a lovely bone there, Raphael, to start talking about some of the stuff I'm working on at the minute, but I'll try not to take it too literally. But I wonder if you could speak a bit more there about the animal rights and the rights of nature aspects. I know a lot of people working in the more theoretical approaches to legal personhood might reject the granting of rights to an abstract entity like an ecosystem, like a river, like a mountain, these things that we're seeing taking place through legislation and courts all over the world. So given that there's a vast amount of literature rejecting that comparison, would you be able to speak more as to why you think that is something you think is valuable for the animal rights context in particular?
It's a good question. And, maybe Sean will have thoughts on this too, but the way I look at it is with the, sort of increasing, just the climate crisis becoming increasingly problematic, there will be an increasing need also to explore connections between, approaches that try to pursue rights for animals and those that try to pursue rights for nature, because animals are part of nature, nature is part of animals. There's an obvious connection here that I think we're bound to have to explore in more detail, just because of the political urgency of, where we're headed with this planet. But maybe on a more sort of conceptual level, I could see it being really, helpful for the animal rights community in particular to think about, okay, you mentioned a couple of cases in New Zealand, India, mountains, rivers, and other natural entities having been recognized as legal persons. Well, here's an example where, legal personhood was granted to an entity that wasn't a human being and that wasn't a corporation either, right? So that would seem to be a point worth exploring. And I know that many really good people are already exploring those conceptual links. Similarly, the question of legal representation of standing, in some contexts, at least as far as I understand it, where rights of nature were granted, some mechanism for legal representation was created too. Again, representation that doesn't involve the sort of human being affected acting directly, claiming their own interests, but there being a sort of an intermediary, a guardian, or representative of sorts. And I'm sure interesting lessons could be learned for animal rights too, which is obviously an area that faces similar representation issues with animals not being able to bring their own lawsuits. So those are just 2 points where I think we could learn a lot from as animal rights thinkers, and potentially rights of nature could learn from animal rights too.
I think that procedural point's a really interesting one there, Raffael. And before I let Sean add anything to it, I didn't know if I'm the only one, but I was getting a bit of interference when you were speaking there, Raffael, particularly when you leant forward. It was a bit hard to find some of the words. So I don't know if there's an issue with your microphone or if it's my headphones, but yeah, I just thought I'd say just in case. But Sean.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Raffael. I think, whenever we sort of say, well, humans have rights and nothing else can, then you go, oh, what about corporations? And you go, yeah, okay, apart from corporations. So in a way, the sort of the mold or the limitation has already been broken. But I think Raphael's right. I think the idea of considering other entities as potential holders of rights allows us to rethink that limitation and go, yeah, it's possible that something else can have rights other than humans. Now, obviously some of the sort of mountains, rivers, and so on that have been granted rights, sometimes it has been done in a sort of recognition of respect, particularly of indigenous relationship with land. Sometimes it's been done in terms of practicalities, allowing that entity, the river or whatever, to be represented and perhaps defeat things like pollution and so on. But whichever the reason, it opens up the idea that this is something we can feasibly think about. And I think it's also connected with one more point, which is the idea of granting rights to things, to entities that are not human, helps with this challenge to human exceptionalism. The idea that, well, that humans have rights and, we can pretty much do what we like because of that. It's very hard and woe betide if you try and take those away. And so any of these chinks in the armor, I think, help challenge the human exceptionalism idea. And yes, helps pave the pathway for other entities, hopefully animals. Not sure about robots yet, Josh, I won't lie. But at least it opens up and causes a discussion, which I think, certainly before the sort of rivers and mountains one, just wasn't being had.
Thanks, Sean. Jump in here with a question. The concluding chapter of the book I find interesting. It's about animal rights as a social justice movement. And you note that there's a challenge. The challenge is the necessity of political compromise. And in my research, I'm certainly seeing that. I'm looking at so-called invasive species. What are the rights of those animals considered invasive? Do they have fewer rights than animals considered native to an area, or indeed humans who live in an area who they might jeopardize through predating on their livestock or crops? But why do you think it's important to consider animal rights in this wider political context as a social justice movement?
Interesting. Well, I think the primary reason is that for animal rights to make progress, it needs, of course, public support. Social justice, I think, is a well-established way of engaging people, bringing people together on and challenging fundamental social attitudes, whether it's to do with race or gender or disability and so on. So social justice is the way that great groups of people can come together and discuss and organize and bring about change. Obviously, at the moment, many of the primary social justice movements are to do with people and improving the conditions of sectors of society. In a way, the question is whether animals are part of that society or not. And I think we left it open in the chapter to say, is animal rights part of social justice or not? And what we were trying to do is, I think, lay out both the context, the relationship, say, between the feminist movement in particular and animal rights, and the extent to which there seemed to be overlap, obviously issues of intersectionality, and those sort of notions. And what we were trying to do was basically present to the reader that they shouldn't be seeing animal rights as sort of completely standalone, but that animals could be considered as part of a wider part of our wider society. So when we think about us, just as we're starting to think about us including the planet, so us should include animals on the planet. So what we were really doing was introducing the reader to the ideas and saying that here was a space that perhaps animal rights could fill and broaden our understanding of social justice.
Yes, and perhaps just to add one thought there to what Sean is saying, I think we approached the chapter from the point of view of learning lessons as well, because I think as different as different rights movements are, they are to some extent also similar, and there's parallels that can be drawn and that have been drawn, including by animal rights folks. And I guess we were interested in exploring what lessons animal rights can learn from other movements where they succeeded in achieving their goals, but also where they failed to do so, and what lessons animal rights can learn from that. But I think on another and perhaps more problematic level, something that we discuss also is comparisons that have been drawn by animal rights scholars and activists with other movements in ways that have perhaps more instrumentalized those movements, and that may have come at the cost of alienating others, have made them see animal rights as a problematic cause, perhaps. And we explore that notion through some PETA campaigns that were, carried out that had sort of, sexist and other, sort of connotations if they weren't overtly so. And we explore sort of, what that means for animal rights. Is it not allowed anymore to draw any comparisons? In other words, do we lose out on potential lessons we can learn because we're not drawing these parallels anymore because we shouldn't? Or is there room for some, sensible parallels and comparisons that can be drawn? And if so, what do they look like? So we wanted to sort of problematize that part as well.
I think, sorry to dive in there, Sebi, with a follow-up before the next questions start coming in. And I think having taught a very similar course in the last year, that comparison was certainly the one that a lot of the students at Newcastle found particularly problematic. I mean, even people who were fully bought into the animal rights struggle, for want of a better way of putting it, didn't like the embeddedness of this in the broader social justice content. They found that comparison very problematic. And I suppose it comes back to a point Sean raised previously, highlights, I suppose, the human-centric nature of a lot of this work that we're doing. So to tie that to a question, I suppose, is that, how do you see us getting past that? If this is something that even people who are bought into this idea struggle with, will the textbook, I think, help us get past that, the way that you've presented the ideas in that very neutral way? Is that the best way through this, do you think? Or do you see which maybe you could have taken a harder line?
It's an interesting question. I'll start, and I'm sure Sean will have more to say on this perhaps too. Again, I think I would want to emphasize that the book didn't want to say, you know, here's the way forward, because that's not what we wanted to book to do. We wanted to say, look, this is what's been happening. Some people have found that problematic. Here's the reasons they have given for that. Here's some answers that they've received. And we leave it at that.
I suppose to be provocative, Raphael,
yes,
you could say that even by allowing the comparison to make, you're kind of taking a side there, aren't you?
Yes, I think that's, I mean, it's certainly true that by, you know, just by virtue of putting one word on paper, you've already taken a decision, you've made some evaluation. So it's true that, you know, there's no way for this book, nor any book for that matter, to be completely neutral by virtue of the topics we choose, how we present them. So that's absolutely true. I think what I was keen to emphasize in that chapter was that there is a challenge here. Basically, it's a paradox, if you like. On the one hand, we know that some comparisons can be problematic and have been made in problematic ways that serve to instrumentalize other causes, that have maybe, you know, operated with a view of, you know, say in the context of, you know, sort of disabled people with a sort of fixed view of their nature, essentialist view, sort of not taking into account the problematic assessments that lie behind that. Whilst at the same time trying to take seriously this notion that is being put forward in those movements too, you know, critical disability studies, ecofeminism, or others, that there are interlocking oppressions here, right? There's an intersectionality here where similar mechanisms seem to be underlying, you know, the oppression of animals and, you know, other vulnerable beings. So basically, the challenge that I see is how do you take that seriously, that idea of intersectionality and interlocking oppressions, whilst also, you know, making sure that you're not drawing simplistic comparisons that serve to harm more than they, you know, benefit anyone. So I looked at it more as a challenge that we wanted to present to the reader, and then to, you know, leave it up to them.
Yeah, let me pick that up. I mean, I entirely agree with Raphael. We felt it was appropriate to present animal rights. How should one think about animal rights? Is it part of social justice? You're right, of course, Josh, by putting it on the page, we're already implying a link. And in doing so, we were, you know, quite keen to ensure that we were consistent with a lot of the literature, particularly things like feminist literature, as you know, refers to the commonalities between oppressions, the commonalities of power, of control, of dominance. The irony, particularly in some aspects of feminist movement, where the irony is pointed out that, you know, oppression here is bad, but oppression over there, well, we don't do oppression over there. We're interested in this oppression, not that one. So I think it would be, I think there's an unavoidable question. Now, how readers answer it, hopefully we've left it up to them. That would have been our objective, and yeah, I think some of your students and others are going to say, no, we don't think it's social justice. Social justice is about protecting people. You know, human rights are protecting humans. Social justice is about people and their social lives, and we shouldn't bring animals into that. There was a second reason, though, that we wanted to include these, and that's part of the paradigm by which we designed the course and taught it, and that led to the book. And that is that the paradigm was one of law reform. In other words, the idea of saying, let's look at animal rights as a law reform issue. How do you go about that? Well, you go about it by thinking about the existing law, thinking about the possibility of whether there's gaps between the existing law and current social values, ethical values, and so on. And then looking at what can be done to change it, to bring to what reforms can be considered. And then, of course, to think about how that would be received. In other words, where there would be interest, where, what the public would think of these things. So we felt that putting it alongside, I say alongside social justice, not within, putting it alongside social justice seemed to us to be the right thing to do. But yeah, I don't know whether animal rights is a social justice movement, is part of that movement.
I think, and again, Sebi, I'm sorry, I just want to apologise to Raffael and Sean for giving them a hard time with that question, really, before handing back over. I think you both actually do a great job of doing what your aim was there, Sean, particularly locating this at the end of the textbook as you have this discussion is very much forward-looking. You almost give it as a gift to the reader, as in like, here is the terrain, now over to you, go and make something happen. So I think that inclusion where it is incredibly valuable, and you certainly accomplished what you set out to do by putting it there. So
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, hopefully you'll be inspiring, the next generation of animal rights law students, practitioners. You're giving them the information, and it's up to them to run with it and do what they will and make their decisions. So I also like the exercises throughout. They're really encouraging people to think critically about this field. Do you have another question, Josh, or do you want me to ask one?
Oh, I was going to be quiet for a while. I think people have heard enough of me now.
Well, then we can look towards the future a bit. I mean, by putting this together, you've read all the various different debates, welfarist, abolitionist debates. Do you think this historical precedence that you outline is important to guide the future of animal rights law? Or do you imagine something radically different, and what precipitates this kind of change and transformation? From what I'm doing, I'm looking at IPBES, the biodiversity panel, IPCC for biodiversity, and they have transformation and transformational change working group. So, and with biodiversity loss, it has to be done quickly. Change has to happen quickly because biodiversity loss is sort of unprecedented in human times. So can change with law reform be done rapidly, or is it going to be gradual and incremental? Do you have any opinions on this?
So Sebi, I'll start by just picking up your point about exercises before answering your question, because we couldn't have done these exercises without the help of our research assistants. I'd like to just give them a shout out here, if that's fine, because they've really been terrific. We had Katarina Brown, Pablo Perez Castello, Mo Ezan, Michael Gold, Sam Groom, Ankita Shankar, Nico Stubler, and Zoe Tong, who've really helped us with not just the exercises, but the whole book. So a big thanks to them. The book wouldn't exist without them. And while I'm already, giving out shout outs and thank yous, Roberta Bassi, our editor at Harp Publishing, has just been terrific. And I think she's in the room here too. So just a big thanks to Roberta. She's been great. Again, without her, the book wouldn't exist. Many other people to thank. You'll find them in the list of acknowledgements, but those are just the ones I wanted to mention here because you brought up exercises and they really helped a lot on that. But now to your question, Sebi, and sorry for that. It's a difficult one. I think it is tempting to say that change is always gradual. And I think that's true just by virtue of, the need for political compromise that we're seeing and that we talk about, in the book. But I think that doesn't necessarily mean that there cannot be quantum leaps, if you like, or small jumps, because I think what animal rights is about, as I understand it at least, it is about a different paradigm, right? So if you think of this Thomas Kuhn, this idea of paradigm changes, you start to think about something in different terms, within a different framework, different concepts, different language. And so the cases, say, that we discuss in the litigation chapter, Cecilia, Estrelita, Happy, many others, they may seem like, well, maybe they seem big enough, as they are, but it may seem, well, this was just an individual animal, say, in the case of Estrelita, being recognized, and sadly, for that matter, an animal that had already passed away, recognized as a fundamental rights holder under the Ecuadorian constitution. But there's one animal. But there's a different paradigm here. We're now thinking of animals in terms of fundamental rights holders. And there's certain things that come with that, certain associations, certain legal implications also. You can no longer be treated in the same way as a table can be treated, right? There's a complete paradigm shift that's happening here now, where I think leaps are happening. But perhaps also to answer your question, what does it take? I think sometimes law leads and sometimes it follows. And some judges in particular have been quite progressive, and they've taken that leap and have decided that yes, an animal should be protected through habeas corpus, say, think of Cecilia, for instance. But I think the judges can only go so far. If public opinion isn't in a place where there's enough support for judgments that will be seen as radical, there's not going to be very many of these judgments. So I think there's always this sort of, relationship between sometimes the law leading, sometimes it following public opinion. And I don't think the two can ever go really, sort of far from each other. I'll just leave it at that. I'm sure Sean has thoughts on that question too. He's thought about it a lot.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, Sebi. I think, just picking up your biodiversity and so on. Yes, obviously there are potentially different units of analysis in terms of ecosystem, in terms of species and species protection, and as Raffael said, whereas animal rights is about the individual animal. In one sense, you could say, well, gosh, things are terribly different, and environmentalists are quite happy to deal with alien species and all these sort of things. And we joined a group in Cambridge, and we had to be interviewed, and they were quite concerned because they said, well, you do realize that we're quite happy killing alien species, don't you? And you guys want to protect them. And so we said, well, yes, we understand that, but there's plenty of space. And I think that's the point. I talked earlier on about one of the objectives of the book was to normalize animal rights law, and certainly as far as a legal course is concerned, we want to normalize it. But I think there's also a need for normalizing it as an idea where people go, oh, okay. And it's very hard, I think, sometimes to see change happen, because we don't realize, because we live in the present, and you sort of make comparisons about, the high street's looking a bit shabby or a bit better, or this area is a bit tidy or whatever. But actually, there's been huge social shifts, almost unbelievably huge, such that you would look back at what your parents or grandparents did, and there's a quote, I don't have the precise quote, but words to the effect of, you look back at your parents or grandparents' generation, and not only can you not understand how they believed those things, you can't understand how they could possibly have believed them. In other words, they are so alien in ways that, as I say, going back not very far, people talked about environment, people talked about different races, people talked about different jobs for different groups of people, men and women distinction, all of these things. And you look at them now and you're aghast at the change, at the difference, and how could people have possibly said and done those things? And I think the same thing applies here. I think that at one level, you could say, yes, there's a distinction between, say, biodiversity and protecting species and protecting the individual animal. However, I don't think it much matters. And this is why Raffael and I, for example, pulled back from engaging in the abolition welfarist debate. And we've done that ever since we started the teaching, because it was just, we didn't find it fruitful. We found it just sort of internal combat. And it's the same, and it's the same thing here. What is important is that people think about it. People go, yeah, okay, I hadn't thought about that. That's something I hadn't realized. I hadn't realized how chickens were kept, or I hadn't realized what we're doing, or I hadn't realized that the fact that humans can do something doesn't mean that we should, and that there's other players out there. I mean, one of the issues on, perhaps the reason it's taken us so long to adapt or respond or begin to adapt to climate change and so on, loss of biodiversity, is it just didn't really didn't seem to be part of our thinking. I came across the word ecosystem. Apparently it was only coined in like the 1960s. And before that it was just not, things weren't knitted together. James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, all of these things. So I think this is all part of the same notion, which is getting people to think about these things and hopefully be more reflective, and that'll impact on biodiversity and protecting wildlife, and also into animal rights. Having said that, I'm not entirely convinced that animal rights is going to come quickly. I think it's taken a couple of generations for vegetarian to be normal, and another generation for vegan to be normalized. I think a system of animal rights might take 50 years. But on the other hand, I think there's certainly areas, particularly in relation to biodiversity and wild animals, where there's a very good opportunity for animal rights. In particular, Raffael and I have talked about this. I think the first animal rights could well come about for cetaceans in the oceans. And I think the idea of a segment of the ocean being regarded as the territory for the animals, the cetaceans, and other animals that live there, I think is a very feasible notion. And there's some very good draft treaties, including one we talk about in the book, the Cetacean Treaty, which talks about respect. It talks about not being property. It talks about leaving habitat alone. And my own personal favorite, some of you may be aware of, it talks about respecting and protecting the culture of cetaceans, which I find a beautiful idea.
Yeah, and as more research is showing, many different animal groups have their own cultures. So, the more research on this, the better, because that can perhaps move us from just thinking about these issues to actually feeling and emotionally engaging and understanding the life worlds of other beings which we inhabit the planet with. But yeah, I'll leave it maybe to Josh now for a question.
I think the hope's a nice point to start picking up on, actually, there, Sean, the idea of where we're going. And again, for the benefit of people who haven't seen the book, I think you do a really good job of kind of taking people on that journey with you, laying that historical foundation, the philosophical foundation, showing where the debates have been, to introducing how legal systems are responding to these issues, both through the courts and in statutory law as well. So where do you, I suppose, I mean, we know cetaceans, I think, are on the radar, pardon the pun a little bit there. But, and again, to tie back to your point you were saying earlier, Raffael, the online element of this book as well goes into a lot of detail on where jurisdictions are in all of those issues, in terms of animals' interests protected through litigation, through the courts and legislation. Which country, I suppose where I'm getting at, is which jurisdiction do you see the most hope in, having compiled this very comprehensive project? Is there a country that either of you are looking at, a jurisdiction that either of you are looking at and thinking, yeah, that's somewhere that we'd like to be. They're doing a good job at bringing all these issues together in a way that can meaningfully advance not just animal rights in the abstract, but also the more general biodiversity and environmental protection that we all want to see. Is there somebody that you think is doing that really well, and why?
So I think there's no jurisdiction that does everything right, unfortunately. But there's many jurisdictions that are doing small things right, or that are going in an interesting and promising direction. I think I mentioned a couple of examples. I think as far as litigation efforts are concerned, Latin America seems a really, promising place to look at. I mentioned Ecuador, Argentina, Brazil too. It's got a really interesting constitution that's then litigated. If we're looking at sort of legislation-based changes, I think really interesting countries at the moment include Finland and Switzerland. So something we discuss in the book is this really interesting proposal for a Bill of Rights, essentially, for all sentient animals in the Finnish constitution. And it's really a super well thought through proposal that Visa Korki and others have put together. I think it's now in the process of being proposed to the Finnish parliament, but it's only something to keep an eye on. In Switzerland, we've had some interesting citizens initiatives, as some of you may already know, including one on fundamental rights for primates that was turned down by the citizens, but it created sort of a really big debate on the topic, lots of media attention, and more people became aware of the interesting and fascinating capacities of these different species, going to a point that Sebi was making, I think. Just our scientific sort of scientific studies and how the media reports about them and how people receive them can make a really big impact and be really meaningful. But so yes, just to go to your point, Josh, I'd say we'd be looking at different jurisdictions who are doing different things right. India is interesting too, Pakistan too. I don't want to leave those out, but yes, it's probably a matter of sort of pick and choose depending on whether you're looking at legislation or litigation.
I think I would probably, I agree with Raphael. I don't think there's one standing out. I would probably go for the EU. It's made steady progress in terms of welfare laws and welfare legislation. And of course, improving welfare laws requires you to think about the animals, requires you to say, why are we doing this? Why should we improve welfare? Well, because what we're doing is harmful or unpleasant or painful or stressful for animals. So it gets you into the fray by being interested in welfare laws and passing welfare laws. In order to do that, you have to care about the animals in themselves to start with. So in many ways, that's very positive, and the momentum should continue. There is a somewhat cynical view that says, well, actually, if you have good welfare laws, the public go, well, we've got good welfare laws, so we can carry on. We don't need to worry about it. I'm not sure I'm convinced of that view, but it's a valid view. So I would probably go for the EU in the sense of it's going in a good direction. But obviously nowhere in legislative terms is really progressing rights as such. That's the best we've got, I'm afraid.
Grand.
Okay, I think that's a beautiful, hopeful note to end our conversation on. So thank you very much for these interesting reflections. And we can now open the floor to the audience to ask their own questions.